I just want to welcome everyone who's listening in. We are really glad to have you here for How Does Your Garden Grow? The how-tos and many benefits of community gardening. Over the course of about the next hour, we are going to explore some basic technical things for community gardens and how you can get those started in your own areas. And also, we're going to talk a little bit about why it matters to us as people of faith to garden in the first place. So my name is Katie. I work with the Church of the Brethren Office of Public Witness and the Global Food Crisis Fund on Going to the Garden, which is a grant-giving program of these two organizations that enable congregations to either start or continue and supplement community gardens to benefit their own community and to strengthen the relationships that they have with others in the community. If this webinar strikes your fancy and you get interested in community gardening and want to do something in your own area, you can send me an email at kfurrow@brethren.org. At this time, I'll go ahead and introduce our presenters and kind of give a layout of what's going to happen this evening. So our first presenter is Ragan Sutterfield, who is a writer and ecological theologian based at the Virginia Theological Seminary. We also have Dan and Margo Royer-Miller, who are a husband and wife farming team who have years of experience doing organic farming and biointensive agriculture. And we also have Gerry Lee, who is an urban farmer who has worked in diverse neighborhoods in Boston and Philadelphia and bringing agriculture to unique spaces. So we're going to hear from each of these folks for a little while tonight, and then after all three have shared their thoughts and their feelings, then we're going to open it up to questions from you all that you might have. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass things on over to Ragan to get us started. So Ragan, we cannot hear you. Can you try and get your mic turned on? Let's see, maybe while we try and get that worked out, Dan and Margo, would you be willing to go ahead and share for right now? And Ragan and I can work on getting some stuff straightened out.
Yeah. We had a little trouble getting our mic figured out at the beginning too. So we were going to share some basic ideas and tips around starting a garden. And for us, at least, we found the experience of growing a garden so life-giving as far as I appreciate my food that is on my table. And even if I don't grow it, I appreciate and I think about the farmers who did and the soil that did. So in that way, I appreciate my food and my life more just from the aspect of growing a garden. So the first point I'll put out there is that in starting a garden, starting small is so important because you can get in over your head really easily and then it can feel overwhelming, or you can look at a seed catalog and see all the things you want to grow. So starting small is a really, really great thing. Maybe that's just a couple pots with tomatoes and basil, or maybe that's a small plot, like 25 square feet or something, and with a few rows of lettuce, some tomatoes and basil, a row of peppers, something like that. One of the really nice things about gardening and farming, at least as we do it in Biointensive, is that you can do it anywhere that has at least 11 hours of sunlight. So you can do it on your lawn, you can do it in your church, right next to the parking lot, wherever it might be. And you don't need special soil, you don't need a built box. Those things have their places, but you can just use the land that you have. So start small and do it where you have space.
So to talk about soil, which is pretty much the most important part of your garden, besides you and maybe what you're trying to grow, is so soil. And there are two ways to look at soil in terms of the substance that it is, and that's the soil texture and the soil structure. Soil texture is when people are talking about sand, silt, and clay, and the mixture of those that you have, which people sometimes get pretty hung up on. You don't really have to worry about that. If your soil is too sandy or too clayey, there are things that you can do that are easier than importing enough of the other elements to make it like that nice loamy stuff. It's the valley bottom thing that everybody wants in their garden and farm. Soil structure, however, is how those particles, the sand, silt, and clay, are held together in aggregates. And so there are things that you can do to improve the soil structure without having to change the soil texture. Part of that is loosening your soil, depending on how compact it is, creating some pore space. The pore space is what allows the roots to penetrate and the water to penetrate and air to get in as well, and enough cavities for the microbes to do their thing. So digging is the best for your long-term soil structure in terms of how you're going to cultivate, rather than using a rototiller. But if a rototiller is what you're going to use to do it, then, you know, anything you need to do to create the pore space that you'll have. Using compost is really important. It's probably the single most important thing you can do to make your garden healthier. In the process of cultivating the soil, you lose organic matter. And so you need to return that in some way. The organic matter is humus and some other elements that are the result of the compost process, either naturally or man-made compost. And those do things like the compost, the organic matter, is food for the microbes. It helps make nutrients more available to the plants. It holds water. If you need water to be held better, it drains water more easily if you've got heavy clay soil. Binds particles together and helps you get that good soil structure. That's all to say compost is really important, and you should make that your main additive that you're using. Growing your soil with plantings, choosing plants when you're in the elective side of planting, not the vegetables that you're aiming for, but extra stuff. Rye, cereal rye, which is an annual plant, you plant in the fall usually, that has roots that dig the soil really effectively. So thinking about what kind of plants you can do that will do some of that digging also. Keeping your soil covered is very important. Growing with intensive planting rather than in row culture keeps the soil covered simply by the plant vegetation, and that's really helpful. And then also over the winter or in the summer, when you're between pulling something out, maybe pulling your beans that aren't producing anymore and putting something else in, if it's going to be a month or so before something's filling that space, you can broadcast buckwheat or amaranth or something that's going to germinate really fast and cover the soil. And then when you have something else you're going to plant, you can pull that out and put the new thing in. And also then for the winter, a lot of people don't plant anything at all over their winter. And that leaves the soil completely bare. If you plant something, again, like the rye or wheat, some kind of legume that will survive, Canadian field peas are hardy enough to work for us. Just something that will be in the soil with its roots active. And every time it warms up enough for that to be growing, then that does good things for your soil. But even if you don't want something growing, you can get some oats and broadcast those when they still have enough time to grow. They'll grow up, and then when the cold weather really hits, it'll kill them, and they'll fall over, and they'll cover your soil and keep it from eroding. So that moves us into the garden ecosystem. Garden is an ecosystem.
So your soil is the foundation there, and then when you think about kind of the bigger picture, nature does not have a vacuum. So when you look around you, there are green things growing everywhere that there's space to grow. And that's going to be true in the garden. So once you cultivate the soil, you put your compost in, you do your planting, any kind of space that's not covered in some way by your planting is going to start to grow weeds. But weeds also have a role in the garden. So in many garden systems, people pull weeds as much as they can to get them out of there and have this nice, clean, tidy garden with the plants that you planted, and then you can see the soil. But weeds are awesome because they help cover your soil and keep the water in, prevent evaporation, and they also, because their roots are in the soil, they encourage the soil biology that's there and help to create structure and more organic matter with their root material. So weeds coming up is not the end of the world and can be a service to you, as well as some of them are edible. There's purslane and lamb's quarter, which are really common weeds over most of the United States, and clover and pigweed. Those are all edible weeds, so sometimes you can get a benefit there. And then it's always advantageous to take your weeds out before they go to seed, or to at least get the seed heads. But while they're covering your soil, as long as they're not infringing on the growth of your plant that you planted there and you want it to grow there, weeds are actually an asset in your garden system. The other ecosystem piece that we want to think about is animals and insects that may come into your garden space. So as you're starting up, it's advantageous to think about what animal pests you may have around. Do you have rabbits in your area? Do you have voles and mice that might be around and might be something that would come into your garden and nibble on things? If you do, then you want to think ahead about that. What kind of a fence do you need? Do you have deer that are roaming? That's one of the things we have here. So our gardens need to have deer fencing. So what kind of a fencing system, if you need that, are you going to want to put in? Additionally, you need to do a raised bed that you can put a screen under because you have a lot of active underground animals. So a few things to think about as you're planning your garden system. And then insects are part of the wider ecosystem and play a really essential role in a garden system too. There are lots of beneficial insects in your soil as microorganisms, and also then the insects that are on the plants and such. So you can encourage all the beneficial organisms, the ones that pollinate and also the ones that are predaceous and are going to attack any insect pests that you may have, by growing flowers. Planting flowers around the outside of a bed, or having plenty of space for flowers in and out can be a wonderful thing. And blue and purple flowers especially will attract a lot of pollinators, as well as white flowers. So if you have cilantro growing in your garden, let it flower and take advantage of the fact that that's going to be drawing insects for you. Borage is another plant that is a good insect attractor, and the purple flowers of the borage plant are also edible. So that's another fun little advantage. Flowers can also play the role of inhibiting or deterring pest insects. So marigolds, for example, and nasturtiums are popular plants and do a lot of work in the garden as far as pest deterrents go, insect deterrents. And your nasturtium flowers are also edible, so that gives you a benefit too. Anyway, your insects can be indicators of how the balance is going in your garden too. If you have a big insect pest outbreak, kind of watch it, and it can maybe help you think about, where are my imbalances? Did I put on tons and tons of compost, and so something's coming after that organic matter, or my plants have too much nitrogen, or whatever the case may be. Did I not create enough airspace, and so my plants don't have enough air, and so they're weak and insects are coming? So insects can help you think about the balance in your garden as well. So the next piece we'll think about are our plants. You can do a couple different things for planting, right? You can plant transplants, or you can go ahead and sow your seeds on the garden. I would recommend transplants as a very easy way to start, and there are also a lot of other advantages. You get to choose healthy plants from the beginning, and they'll cover your soil faster when you put them in as transplants. And where you get them is a little bit of a question. Local farmers and gardeners, especially who maybe sell at a farmer's market, can be a great source for transplants, because they're going to know when it's the right time in your season to plant a transplant. And they're ideally going to have them that are good size. Garden stores can be a good place too, though sometimes I've seen garden stores with transplants that are too old and a little bit too big to be put into the garden at their healthiest state. So finding other local places for local farmers for transplants is a really great thing if you have access to that. Don't buy transplants like tomatoes that already have flowered in the flat, or your maybe cabbages or broccolis or something like that. If you see them starting to flower, then you know that that's not going to grow a healthy plant for you. So try to start with a good healthy transplant. You can also grow your own if you're feeling adventurous as a garden start thing. Eventually, that may just happen very naturally as part of the garden growth. In order to grow your own, you need any container. You can use any kind of container that is 3 inches deep on the interior and has drainage. So you just need some soil in that container, and then you put your seeds there on the top and pat them down so they get good soil seed contact, little soil on top of that, and then water it in so that the moisture level is about a wrung out sponge kind of a thing. And then once the green stuff comes up, it needs to be in the light so that they don't get really long trying to reach for the light. Lettuce and tomatoes are good, easy ones to start with. And once your seedlings come up, you want to make sure that they each have enough room to grow into a big enough seedling. So maybe that means you're going to thin it out a little bit if there are too many in there, or maybe you put the seeds in with enough spacing for the seedling to grow. And then, of course, if you're growing your own transplants, you need to protect them from mice or birds or moles or whatever may get to them. Depending on where they are. If they're inside your house in a window that gets a lot of light, that makes it pretty easy, or in a greenhouse space. But sometimes a cover over your flat can help a little bit as your seedlings are starting to grow. So we'll pass on to Dan here for the next piece.
So in terms of knowing some dates for your garden, the most important ones for you to know are the frost dates. Really, and that's the last frost that you have in spring, which we're still at least a month and a half out from here, and then the first frost of the fall. So, of course, the last frost in the spring is going to dictate when you plant those plants that are a little more tender, which is virtually every plant that you're going to put as a main season crop doesn't really want to be frozen in the ground. And so you find out what your last frost date is, and that's a generalization. It's something that you find out either from an agricultural extension agent, which around here is Ohio State University hosts them, but you can find that online for your area, the first and last frosts. And that's a guideline to go with. We often say, okay, our last frost date is supposed to be such and such. We'll plant our crops that really care a week after that, just to make absolutely sure that they're not going to have any ugly surprises. So it's the bookend for your main season, really. If you're planning how long you're going to have to harvest something, then you need to look at then your first frost in the fall end of things. You don't want to plant something that's going to bear fruit or seed or whatever in the next couple months. And the next couple months is all of a sudden October, and it freezes before you get a chance to harvest that. But you also want to know what your first frost date is in the fall, which here is October 15th, I believe, because that's going to help you decide when you need to get your cover crops in for the winter, which you're going to plant because it's good for your soil. Mm-hmm. And it's so easy. You're just broadcasting some seeds over there that are going to grow and get a chance to establish before it starts getting really cold. So, maybe a month before that first frost date, you'll have ideally your cover crops sown. So much for the frost date. Oh, and keep data on your own. Put a little thermometer out there, maybe keep track in a little notebook, because that'll tell you more over a few years. That will tell you more about your own climate than you can learn from the agricultural extension agents. They have a broader brush that they paint with for the region, and you've got a microclimate in your area. We all do. One of the best bits of advice that I can give for learning about what's going on in your area is to get to know other gardeners, and even other larger scale farmers will have an eye on what goes on with your climate, what kind of plants grow better for your area. So get in touch if you see somebody down the road who's got a garden going, and they look like they're having a good time. Then go up and lean over the fence and say, hey, can you tell me something about somebody who's taking care of their garden is always going to want to tell you about what's going on there. And you can build a network and a small community that way. It's a great resource to have fellow gardeners. So, and then finally, in terms of learning and applying what you know and what you're learning, don't get hung up on any method or any advice. Don't say, well, so and so told me that I should do such and such. It's not working out for me, but I need to just keep doing it because that's what the book said, or that's what so and so said. Most of us who've been gardening for years have a philosophy by which we live. We do biointensive agriculture. It's what we were trained in, and there are a very specific set of methods. If you were following those methods and they were preventing you from really enjoying what you're doing, or from getting the task done that you need to do in the garden, then throw that away. Make it so that you feel free in your garden. You feel free to really enjoy working in the soil and growing food, growing beautiful things, making a better environment, because that's really what it's all about. So don't get hung up on any little bits of advice. Just do it.
So to wrap up, when in my very first year of farming, I was always terrified that I was going to kill the plants, especially the first weekend that our farmer, we were interns in Pennsylvania, the first weekend the farmer left us in charge for the weekend. I was afraid he was going to come back and find the garden all dead. But so I've learned over the years that plants want to grow, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So we don't have to be afraid as we're going out there and starting to farm a garden that we're going to do it all wrong and kill our plants, because plants are so resilient and they really want to grow. The most important thing is just to give them our love and our good intention. And if we take care of nature and of the natural systems, being attentive to our soil, knowing there's a garden ecosystem there, trying to help that be in balance, then nature works. And that's an awesome, awesome thing. So most of all, just enjoy the miracle of it all and the mystery of it all. And that's what feeds us, from the soil to the seed to the plant and then to the table. It's truly, truly awesome. So enjoy it.
Great. Thank you both so much for those really important tips. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and ask Gerry if he is ready to go ahead and share with us on this theme of how-tos and thing. And then after Gerry, we will hear from Ragan.
Great, thanks, Katie. So I'm going to talk a little bit about urban gardening particularly, and the challenges and opportunities that you'll find in an urban context. As you're probably aware, there's a tremendous urban growing renaissance going on around the country, both with community gardens as well as urban farming, just booming throughout the country. And I think it's a very exciting time for growing in the city, and there's some real opportunities for you as communities of faith to connect to resources in the cities that can help you get started in a community garden. One thing, obviously in the urban setting, you have very different challenges than you do where, say, Dan and Margo are farming. You've got the challenges of a harsh environment and the concrete jungle kind of stereotype. You have many more issues with soil problems, and certainly even some degree of questions for security at points. And yet you also have some real pluses. You have tremendous numbers of people as members of the neighborhood that you live in or community, to be volunteers, to interact with your garden, to learn from your garden and from your growing. And a big part of urban gardening is education, actually. Certainly there is a focus on food production, and the larger efforts at urban agriculture, or urban farms really, are very much focused on producing large amounts of food. But I think generally the focus for most of us, the focus for a community garden in a city context, is certainly to grow some good things that we like, but also to learn from each other and to share the joy of seeing fresh strawberries grow, or for children to learn where carrots come from. Those kind of educational opportunities and moments which are just so special. A couple of the issues of getting started in an urban community garden. And the first one would be site selection. Certainly in the urban context, you have you do have some challenges. The first one would be light. You can't assume in the city that you have 12 hours of bright sunshine as you do out in the country very, very often. So you need to be very much aware as you're picking your site how much light is going to be on your garden, and you need at least 8 hours of good strong sunshine to be effective. So figuring out where the buildings are nearby, if there are old street trees that are shading the piece of land that you're looking at, all that is very important to as you're selecting a site for your community garden. The second thing would be water, obviously. Many of the community gardens that are sprouting up in cities like where I was in Philadelphia are sprouting up on empty lots or in abandoned areas, which is very exciting, but there are challenges to that because very typically they don't have a water source, and you need to work out a water source with the city in order to begin your plot. Certainly, if you're with a school or connected to a community center or a church congregation, you have more opportunities there. And I think that would be important to figure out as you're selecting your site. So light and water are probably the two most crucial aspects of a site selection. The third thing, obviously, would be soil. And in the city, it's a little bit different. It's very much the same principles that Dan and Margo were talking about in terms of what's important in soil. The challenge is very often you have to make the soil from scratch. There are cases where perhaps if you have a school property or a church property that has good soil that hasn't been polluted by industry, you have an opportunity to do direct in the soil planting. However, I would strongly encourage you to get a soil test, regardless of where you're going to plant, just to be sure there are no heavy metals or lead in the soil. And you can do that with many extension services. The University of Massachusetts soil test is a very popular one that I've used with great success. So get a soil test for sure, no matter where you choose to plant. But very often you can't actually plant directly into the soil in the city. You need to do raised beds or some sort of soil over what is there. And that often involves putting down an impermeable barrier over the rubble or the soil that you're building your garden over. And then putting down raised beds with your own composted soil mix. So that's a process, but it's not that hard. And certainly the plus about doing raised beds would be that it's very intensive gardening, and you can be very productive in a small amount of space. And certainly when we're talking about community gardens, it's probably the most common way of doing a community garden. For instance, one that I belonged to in Philly was 50 families living, doing gardening on a empty lot that we turned into a community garden, with a section of it for socializing and for general sharing, and then each family would have a 4 by 10 foot raised bed to grow their vegetables on. You could do that same kind of thing in your congregation or your church or school, and develop a community garden based on a certain number of raised beds. That would be that could be very productive, and it's a great way actually for socializing and just building community amongst the neighborhood. that brings me to community, really. I think that's another huge part of urban agriculture is the opportunities for community. A big part, again, in urban context, production of vegetables isn't generally the top priority. You certainly want to enjoy them, and you can have some for yourself or share them with your neighbors. But I think that there's much more of a emphasis on just the enjoyment of growing, what it means to connect to the earth, even in a austere environment like the city can be sometimes, and also just being together with your community, growing something and teaching children about what it means to respect creation and to be part of God's creation. It's really amazing when you see the joy of children who've been eating, say, carrots all their lives and had no idea where they come from. And very often, many of the beds that I would grow, I really didn't expect any kind of production out of them. It was more basically as a learning process for kids who, as they were walking by my strawberry bed on the sidewalk, that they could pick strawberries and realize that this is where they come from, and talk about with me as a farmer how you make strawberries grow. So the education part of it, as well as building community, is really critical, I think, for community gardening in the city. Looking for the types of sites that you want to have, I think it largely depends upon what your goals are. I would say it's probably pretty critical as you start a community garden project to have a process where you decide with your community what your goals for the garden are. Are you growing? Do you want to grow so that you can actually produce to support, say, an elderly care facility in the neighborhood, or to provide free food to the neighborhood, or are you growing mainly for children? There's many options, and many gardens I've been involved with have been really shaped by the communities that have formed them. One really wonderful community gardening project in South Philly was a project of Hmong refugees from Laos who really just had tremendous joy in forming this community garden and smuggling over seeds from the old country so that they could grow things that they missed about Laos, and get together with their children and their grandparents and socialize in the garden. So really wonderful opportunities for community. On the other hand, it can be very much of a garden for youth. There are very successful youth community gardens that are run by high school youth. Or even in one case, one group I worked with was actually with city prisoners who were growing things in the prison and sharing them, the seedlings, with the community that was providing food for the poor and the homeless in Philadelphia. So there are a lot of different ways to do it, but I think it's really an important first step as a community to decide what are our goals for this community garden, who are we trying to serve, what do we hope to accomplish, what our priorities are, and that will really shape how you design the garden and where you have the garden as well. For instance, if you're really into big production, you probably want to look at a larger property, perhaps a school building, or if the church or congregation has a large yard or large land around it, then that might be a good opportunity. Very often in the city, there just isn't that much land to grow on, and it's really only the institutions that are left that have that kind of space if you're looking for a larger amount to grow. But again, for most of us, I think it's really, you don't need much space. You can even grow on the rooftops or in containers, on walls. There's all kinds of possibilities in the urban setting. You just need the fundamentals, the same fundamentals that Dan and Margo were talking about, of good light, water, good soil, and just to care for the plants in an organic way. I think finally I would just say that it's just a joy to be able to grow in a context where people have really been cut off from greenery, cut off from nature, and cut off from food, and really even from their own right to food. I think part of the real opportunity for communities to do community gardening in the city is both to answer the problem of food deserts in the inner city, where people just poor people don't have the opportunity to get fresh vegetables, but also to reconnect urban dwellers to the joys of nature, the joys of growing, and be able to offer them the chance to participate in that wonderful act of caring for God's creation.
All right, thank you so much, Gerry. I really appreciate that contribution and hearing about what we can do in urban settings and what impact that makes. And I guess now we'll go ahead and hear from Ragan and tie this all together.
My role in this conference call is to give some thoughts on exactly why Christians and churches in particular might be concerned with developing gardens, to give some theological and biblical background for that. I think the first thing we need to think about is how is our human vocation, and that vocation given in Genesis chapter 2, where human beings are created, first of all, from the ground, from the soil. The Hebrew word there is Adamah, which is not just any kind of dirt or soil, but rich agricultural soil. And so we're told that God formed the human being from the rich agricultural soil, the life-giving soil of the land. And so just who we are as people is already connected to dirt and to soil. And in fact, we live our entire lives from the soil. This reality that's communicated in the biblical story is something that's true for all of us, even in modern times. Every day when we sit down to eat, 3 times a day, or however often we sit down, we are eating the products of the soil, so we continue to live from the soil. And it's also true that our bodies return to the soil, however much we might try to prevent that. One day, eventually, our bodies also return to the soil. And we can do that in a healthy way or in a way that's destructive to the environment. So in our anthropology, we are already connected to the soil. And by gardening, we help reflect some of that. And then also, I mentioned our vocation. So just our very nature as human beings is from the soil, but we are also called to the soil and to work toward its flourishing. In Genesis chapter 2, we're told that the man, the Adam, the human being, or even we could say the earthling or the soil being, was placed in the garden, and placed in the garden to till and keep it. So that word till in Hebrew is the word avad, which means to, it actually means, could also mean to serve or to care for, so there's this idea that it's not just to till the land in the kind of form of just to gain productivity for it, or in this kind of industrial way where we're doing something just to get something out of the land, but rather we are cultivating it, where we're working toward its flourishing. So we're working to serve the land and therefore serve the flourishing of the whole of creation. So in Genesis 2, we find this strong indication of what it is to be a human being, both in our very nature and in our calling. And both of those are fulfilled in our gardening. So when we as congregations and people in churches gather together to garden, we are fulfilling something essential both about our very nature and our call in life and our purpose as human beings. Gardens have also throughout Scripture been places where reconciliation takes place. Being cast out of this garden in the first place, we are out of the Garden of Eden. Whenever there's a return to a garden, it's a kind of time of reconciliation and of hope. And one of the great examples of this is with the prophet Jeremiah. God tells Jeremiah to go to Anathoth and to buy some land there and to establish a garden. And it's this kind of absurd act in the face of coming destruction, and yet Jeremiah follows this call, and it's this sign of hope for the people of Judah. And there's a great community garden in North Carolina based around a Methodist church called Anathoth Community Garden that's kind of taken this situation, the story from Jeremiah as its example of what it's about, because this garden is particularly a place of reconciliation for black and white communities in this rural area of North Carolina that have often had strife, and that garden is supposed to be this place of reconciliation. And so gardens fulfill our vocation and our humanity. As indicated in Genesis, they're a place of reconciliation, as we see in Jeremiah. And we can see this reconciliation also in Romans, where in Romans chapter 8, where we see this indication that all of creation is waiting with eager longing for the revealing of the people of God. They're waiting for human beings to return to our true vocation, to serve the full flourishing of all of creation. And we see that and experience that in gardens. Also, gardens are a place where we can experience the abundance and provisions of the land. And in that, we are able to live into a kind of Sabbath life. And that's the kind of Sabbath life that God commands His people to inhabit in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, where Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about not worrying about tomorrow, not worrying about what we're going to eat or how we're going to be clothed. And that's to say that the land is good, that the land is full of abundance and can provide for our needs, that God has provisioned the world to provide for us. Unfortunately, through greed and violence, we've interrupted that provision and that abundance. As Gandhi said, there's enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And so we've interrupted this abundance, but it's there, and we experience it when we garden. When I was doing some farming myself, I did an apprenticeship in farming, and with a longtime sheep farmer, and he also had some honeybees, and I sold honey and lamb and different products for him at the farmer's market. And there was one time there was a couple that came, and they wanted to buy some honey, but they were kind of concerned about what happened to the bees. And they said, do you hurt the bees when you take the honey? And I said, no, we just smoke the bees out, and it doesn't hurt the bees to actually harvest the honey. And then they said, well, why isn't the honey the food for the bees? And I said, well, yes, it's their food, but we always leave plenty for them and plenty for us. And they said, well, why did the bees create so much honey? And I said, well, that honey is they create in abundance. They always create more than they need. When I went back and related the story to this farmer, he said, yes, absolutely. That nature creates more than it needs. It only takes one acorn to generate another oak tree, but yet there are so many oak trees. so many acorns to create so many oak trees, because there's always abundance in nature. And through gardening, we begin to see and feel and experience some of that abundance. We also, in the book of Revelation, we see a picture of a different kind of garden, and that's where God's ultimate reconciliation with all of creation, with all of God's people in the world, comes as heaven descends to earth. Earth doesn't burn up and get replaced by heaven, but heaven descends to earth, and earth is transformed. And we see there this vision at the very end of Revelation of a garden city, a place where the trees and plants will be a place, a sign of healing for the nations. And so we also have a kind of an eschatological view with gardening, similar to that of Jeremiah, that this idea that the fulfillment of all things will involve a reconciliation of humankind and all creation and God, and that will take place around and in a garden. And so by having community gardens at our churches, we are in a way enacting that. So that's a view from all the way from Genesis back to Revelation, a biblical and theological view of why gardens might be important for churches and Christians and our communities of faith. But I want to also talk a little bit about some particular, seeing gardening as a kind of spiritual discipline. Spiritual disciplines are actions that we take on that help us to live into the grace that God has for us. They're not a way of earning grace, but they're a way of helping us to realize and to understand the grace that's being offered to us. And I think that gardening can be an amazing spiritual discipline that can help us live into various forms of grace and virtues that God is offering. Just to take one key example, is humility has been a classic Christian virtue, and it's often understood as just being, not thinking much of oneself, and that has an aspect to it. But humility is really literally being close to the earth. Bernard of Clairvaux, who is a great thinker on humility in the Middle Ages, talked about humility as being living into the truth, living into reality. And as I talked about, the truth of who we are is that we are people from the soil. And when we live close to the earth, when we go close to the soil, we are returning to our truth. And when we live and recognize how we are dependent upon the soil for our sustenance, then we will be less destructive to the creation as a whole. When we understand our dependencies upon creation and that we're a part of this whole web of life that God's created, we will be less destructive than what we're given to when we forget those things. And so gardens can be a way in which we recover humility, in which we are reminded of who we truly are, and are called away from all the kinds of idolatries that would say that we don't really depend upon the earth, that it doesn't really matter what we care about the earth, that really we get our food from grocery stores, that we get our sustenance from all these other places. And gardens help to remind us that no, our food is a gift from God that we find in gardens and on farms, and that we need to understand and always give thanks for that gift. And when we do that, we are moving into this virtue of humility. So gardens are a kind of spiritual discipline that can help call us into that. And there are many more virtues that can be realized, such as patience, having to wait so long for, even a radish, which is one of the fastest growing things. It still takes almost a month between seed time and harvest for a radish. And many other crops take far, far longer, so we can learn patience. We can learn their community, especially as we learn to work together and share our resources. Hospitality gardens can be wonderful places of hospitality, particularly in the context of a church. So there are many Christian virtues that can be realized through just this act of gardening in a community. And so hopefully this has provided some biblical and theological overview of why we should be concerned with gardening, and why Christian communities should take it up as a practice. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ragan. At this time, I will invite all of you to come back up for a time of sharing and questions and answers as we get the question bar pulled up for all of our participants if you have questions. If any of you all have responses to Ragan or to anyone else, please feel free to go ahead and share.
Margo's hanging out with the boys, so it's just me now.
That's fine.
Oh.
Glad to have you.
Getting darker too.
All right. So I believe we should be able to have folks type up questions and send them in if you have any for any of the presenters, and we can take the time to discuss those. Dan or Gerry, did you all have any responses to anything that anyone has said so far?
I really enjoyed hearing, both presentations, but it's funny, I don't often think from the perspective of the urban reality. We're only a mile out from Dayton, like urban Dayton, but we have room to spread. So the idea that you have to pay attention to shadows from buildings, that seriously eats into some of your daylight, is it's a different reality. And I especially like the idea that it kind of hit me as a shock, but I realized almost immediately, like, the truth in it, that in the community garden, it's not really all about growing food, which is what our gardening is about. It's about being there with other people. It's about sharing the space. It's about communing and sharing the joy of that. I really appreciated hearing that.
Yeah, I think thinking about what Ragan was saying in terms of the biblical tradition of the sacredness of the earth and our connectedness to it, I think it's really a wonder. From my experience in urban growing, it's really a wonder not only to see things grow, but for all of us to have interaction with food on a much more intimate level than we're just used to having. One example would be just growing. For a while, I grew a lot of greens, arugula, and lettuces and whatnot, and to share those with my neighbors, and for them to have lettuce that had literally just been picked out of the soil was just a whole different flavor, a whole different kind of experience of eating for them and for me. And I think to share that together and that feeling so connected to the soil and to the wonder of God's creation, I think it really is a special gift. And I do think it's something that communities and particularly churches can grow from and learn from. And I think I like what Ragan was saying in terms of the connection to worship, because I think it's really, there's just so many, obviously we have so many connections in our traditions to food and meals in our worship, but we also have connections, as Ragan was pointing out, to the soil and to growing things and to nature, and I think that's a real gift.
Yeah, I appreciated, Ragan, I appreciated you sharing about your experience selling honey and the people who are really concerned about robbing from nature, and the fact that abundance is everywhere. Nature creates abundance. I resonated with that, and also the idea that, as you were saying, Gerry, bringing gardening into worship, bringing the realizations and the miracles that you witness constantly in the garden into worship, that's a really valid point. And I had never thought about that before, though I confess I've spent many Sunday mornings worshiping in the garden instead of at church. My other reflection, I was taking notes, and the idea that church is getting into gardening as a way to reflect Christ-like living, I mean, both as a service to our own spirits, our own souls, but as a service to the community. I know that in a lot of the urban churches of the Brethren, there's been a shift of demographics. So, for instance, what was once the demographic for the Trotwood Church of the Brethren has ceased to be. And it's a much more multicultural situation, and the community is much more multicultural than it was. And so to use our yard space for garden would be a joyous thing. And to kind of piggyback on, Gerry, what you were saying about having a bed of strawberries there and not worrying about who was taking them. Thinking about the joyous aspect of, like, their kids walking by who have only seen strawberries in saran wrap, maybe. Yeah, I love that.
Okay, great. Thank you all for this discussion so far. We've gotten a question in. So the question is, how... Oh, did I just hear Ragan trying to come through?
A big thing with... And Gerry's question here, one important aspect of worship might be to bring the rural and the urban together through gardening. There's so much of a divide oftentimes between urban people and rural people, and there's such that can be for gardening. So just offer that as a worship.
Okay, thanks, Ragan. So we've got a question that is, how does the vulnerability of depending on something like gardens change our understanding of our dependence on God? So I'll open that up to the three of you all.
Yeah.
Take a first crack at that. I think one of the things I was talking about, the worship experience or the connection to our faith in growing is that you do, a farmer faces challenges, and in a sense you face, it's probably a strong word to say evil, but you face predators. You face, I think of a experience where I had an opportunity to have a larger plot on the edge of the city, and I had long rows of beautiful kale and Swiss chard and a groundhog vicinity, and just came in one night and mowed down 100-foot row of Swiss chard that I had planted, and I was so furious, and I was obviously dealing with a lot of very violent thoughts, and yet I in reflecting about it, I realized, well, it's nature. He's part of nature too. I have to figure out a way to exist with him in a peaceful way without getting a rifle or something. But I think that's it made me appreciate, certainly, which for farmers like Dan and Margo and people who live off of farming, how not only to the weather but to insects or to things like that, and so we are dependent upon in a sense dependent upon God in a very real way through nature, and it's not always easy. Sometimes you feel very conflicted.
Yeah, we don't rely on our garden for either our sustenance or our income. And in that way, we're pretty distant from past generations and from other parts of the world. We, for 2 years, hosted 3-month internships for 2 women from Kenya. And we would start our day in the garden with a prayer. And when one of the 2 women each year, it was true for both pairs of them, when they would say their prayer, at the beginning, they would start by thanking God that they lived through the night, because that was a reality for them in their own communities, and that brought it home seriously. In other parts of the world, it's not a question of perception of security or a question of vulnerability. You're vulnerable and you're insecure, and you put it in the hands of God every day. And that having that spoken by one of our interns, or multiple times from all our interns, really gave me food for thought in the garden, because it's always in the hands of God. And security, we want security, we want our seed stock, we want to build up extra, but it's in the hands of God, really. What's going to happen? Is a groundhog going to come and destroy your whole garden? Yeah, it can happen. And then hopefully your neighbor will share.
One passage that comes to I was in a conversation earlier today, but Jesus sermon playing, talking about the this about and looking to God for as the fields do and as the birds of the air do. Things can be learned in a profound way in the garden, and it can be a challenge to get a real challenge to our understanding of dependence upon God. So I was a time who's committed to Christian nonviolence, and they said that they were fine with that as it came to war, but they said so sure they're okay with that when it came to squash bugs. And so I think we do run into, from this sense of or this reality of dependence, I'm for the justice and burden. It's the control near to we are. Excuse me.
Are you still there, Ragan? You're kind of breaking up near the end.
Yes. Okay, one side.
Okay. Well, I guess, do any of you all have any final thoughts? Ragan, are you still speaking? Okay, yeah. Do you all have any final thoughts on the subject or anything like that before we close up?
Grow a garden. Plant a few plants. Give them lots of love. Be grateful for what you get, even if it's a lesson in what not to do.
All right. Well, for all of you who joined us tonight, I would just like to say thank you and to encourage you to get out there and try it. Kind of like Dan just said, it's always worth it to give it a shot. And if you have any questions for any of the presenters that maybe you just didn't get an opportunity to ask, or if you think of later, again, you can send an email to kfurrow@brethren.org. And we will do our best to get that question to them. Otherwise, thank you and enjoy your evening.